The word of the Lord to Jeremiah was, I proclaim a liberty for you, saith the Lord, to the sword, to the pestilence, and to the famine. And I will make you to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And I will give the men that have transgressed my covenant, and all the people of the land, which pass between the parts of the calf. I will even give them into the hand of their enemies. In Jeremiah 34, God pointed back to the first promise that he'd made to Abram. The land contract is here said to be canceled because the men have transgressed my covenant. God's punishment for Israel's transgressions would be, among other things, a diaspora that would also involve Israel being given into the hand of their enemies. That was the end that God revealed to Abram in the beginning. The issue that a captive Israel faced was the reality of her being punished because she simply would not comply with the terms of her agreement. And God told Abram that in the very beginning. Why? Because God always says in the beginning what will happen in the end. Ironically enough, the test that the Hebrew captives faced was, would they sit and partake of the king's table that would defile them? Of course, this begs the question, what was it that would have defiled them? The Bible doesn't mention any particular food because that really wasn't the first issue. The Hebrew captives ate pulse because it was a diet of vegetables that would not involve them eating anything sacrificed to idols, nor would it be anything that contained blood. That was the first point concerning the issue of their diet being kosher. But it wasn't the only one, nor was it the most important one. The king's table is a term that God used to point to the real issue concerning Israel's punishment, because what God was really getting at was the king's table in the context of Judaism and her covenant relationship with him. In the sanctuary, the king's table is the table of showbread that was found in the holy place of God's tabernacle. The much greater issue that God was addressing was the king's table that must be considered in the context of history, because the lesson of history always points to the greater issue of redemption. The point of the prophecy was Israel being punished, not what the captives would eat. The king's table in Babylon was God referring to the real issue, which was the Sabbath and Israel's violation of it. The Sabbath was God's test concerning Israel's true identity as his covenant people. The Passover was Israel's test, precisely because it was the genesis of Israel's covenant relationship that began in Egypt, which was the first history of Israel being held in captivity. Ironically enough, the test that the Hebrew captives faced was the issue concerning the king's table versus their own, because that would prove whether or not they would understand what the Passover was pointing to. God's question to them was, what was it that would defile them by sitting at Nebuchadnezzar's table? The test that proved Daniel and his fellows was one of appetite, because appetite is what we want from life. Do we live to eat, or do we eat to live? The Hebrews proved themselves faithful because they addressed both issues when they refused to eat anything that was unclean. It also explains why they received an understanding of the king's dream in the vision of Daniel 2. What connected the king's table to the king's vision of the image was the Passover, because that was the point of the image in Daniel 2, which begs the question. If God was telling Israel that her covenant with him would not be fulfilled, what was the point of God testing the Hebrew captives? Why go through all that trouble when it was understood that Israel would not receive the promise. The captive Hebrews' victory of faith did not reflect what the nation would do. So what was the point? What was God saying about Daniel and his compatriots? The prophetic message in Daniel 7 is a mirror image of the history lesson of Daniel 1, because both address the same issue concerning the close of probation. We know this to be true because the Passover is the prophecy concerning probation's close for 3 different generations. The only question is, who will be sitting at that table of the final Passover? In Daniel 1, the Hebrew captives represent that faithful remnant in both their day and the last days. The only difference between chapters 1 and 7 concerns the close of probation for the 2 different generations. The prophecy of Daniel says the test concerning their appetite in chapter 1 will be the same test of understanding that will come in the last days concerning the Passover found in chapter 7, because the Passover is the prophecy of the decision to be faithful to God during the time of the end and the close of probation for each one of the 3 generations that would be tested in their day. In Daniel 1, God gave an apostate Israel over to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel 7, God will give an apostate church over to the hand of the same king of Babylon, referred to in Isaiah 14. The word of the Lord in Isaiah says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations?" In this passage, the king of Babylon in history and the king of Babylon in prophecy are both mentioned in the same inspired breath of God's Holy Spirit, because the fall of the one in history is the fall of the other in prophecy. The principle of first and last says the literal always precedes the spiritual, because the history of the one is always more than just history. In the prophecy of Daniel 1, God addresses the issue of Israel's captivity and why he allowed it. That was the point of the king's table, because it was God pointing to the issue of Israel's fate as a captive nation. In Daniel 1, the king's table was a test that addressed the 2 key issues that concerned their punishment as captives. The first issue was their appetite in a literal sense, because it concerned their bodies as a temple. That test concerned their physical appetite. But that test pointed to the larger issue, which was Israel's true identity as a covenant people. The king's table was God pointing to the Passover because that was the issue of their covenant. It was, after all, Israel's violation of the covenant that had to be addressed. The question was whether or not they would remain steadfast and faithful to their promise, or would they be assimilated into the more dominant culture of the Babylonians, because many of them did. The main issue was the Passover, which was the point of the 3-year period of their being tested. Understanding that Israel would not receive the promise, God had no choice but to use that history as a lesson study in what not to do as his covenant people. God addressed the most important issue that is always his first concern, which was, what would God have to do to save his people? In Daniel 1, the king's table was the symbol that represented Israel's true identity. The test of their fitness to serve the king was the question. Serving the king of Babylon would be one thing. Serving the King of Kings was another matter altogether. That was what God was really getting at. That was the point of the 3-year period, because it pointed to the fact of a failed covenant relationship and the anomaly that was the Hebrew captives' victory of faith. The Hebrew captives are God's symbol of the same promise that was represented on the table of showbread as the 12 loaves. That was good news, because the Hebrew captives were a prophecy of the 12 disciples, who themselves were the promise of the perfect priesthood that was first represented as Noah's sacrifice on Mount Ararat. The 12 disciples sitting at the table of the Last Supper would be the promise concerning God's faithful remnant church in the last day. The Last Supper will be the beginning of the end for the entire world, because the Passover marks that point in time when the end of all things will begin.